Hello, welcome to Convergent Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to bring the conversation I had with Ben Goldfarb. Ben is an independent conservation journalist who has written fiction and nonfiction in various places, such as The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Washington Post, Smithsonian, Scientific American, and other publications. His work has also been anthologized in the Best American Science and Nature Writing. He is the author of two books, the first being Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, which won the 2019 Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. And his most recent book, Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, which was named one of the best books of 2013 by the New York Times. As I said in the conversation, I've had this book on my shelf for many months, and I was able to finally read it, and I just absolutely kind of inhaled it, and I was really, really thankful that Ben agreed to come on and talk all about it. So we talk about road ecology, what it is, what the current landscape of roadways in the U.S. is, and we talk about road crossings and why they're important. We talk about the human impact of animal roadkill and why road crossings can help not only save animals, but also help with car accidents and with human impact as well. We talk about the example of Banff National Park up in Canada and how they were kind of one of the first to really do road crossings in a really beautiful way, actually. We talk about the current state of road crossings, how many there are, what it's like, what it looks like on the West Coast, East Coast, things like that. Federal, state involvement, road crossings in cities, the future of road crossings, and many other topics. I think this is obviously something that doesn't get talked about as much as maybe as it should. Obviously, in conservation circles, it does. But I think it's a really important issue and something that we, whether we realize it or not, we're interacting with every time we get behind the wheel and we drive on a back road somewhere. So I think it is a really super important topic to discuss and to think about. And Ben's doing a great work on this issue. As always, you can find this conversation and other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube. So share, like, follow, all the wonderful things. And now I bring you Ben Goldfarb. I am here with Ben Goldfarb. Ben, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, surely. I mean, as I was telling you before we started, I had your book on my shelf for a couple months, and I was meaning to get to it, and I finally got to it, and I just kind of inhaled it in a weekend. I really, really enjoyed it, and it's a fabulous book. It's called Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, and highly recommend it. So we'll talk about that. Before we do, why don't you tell listeners just a snapshot of who you are, all the relevant details, and what you're currently doing.
Sure. Well, thanks again for reading the book and for recommending it. I'm an environmental journalist, so I write about nature, wildlife, conservation, ecology for all kinds of publications, from National Geographic to The New Yorker to Smithsonian Magazine. And I'm the author of a couple books, Crossings, which you mentioned, and another book called Eager, which is about why beavers are so awesome and why we need a whole lot more of them around the world, especially in the American West. In my spare time, I do a lot of hiking, camping, fly fishing, all the fun stuff that one does in the Colorado mountains where I live.
Yeah, that's the place to do it. It's beautiful over there. I love it over there. So I'm definitely jealous of your time to do it. It's nice over here. I live just in Appalachia, but not to compare. But the Rockies are a bit superior in some ways, at least in terms of the scale. I'll say that scale and grandeur. It's definitely awesome.
The grandeur is pretty incredible, and the outdoor recreation is off the charts. And for me as a wildlife lover, I don't want to disparage, all of the raccoons and opossums that you guys have in Maryland.
Plenty of those.
We've got elk and moose and antelope. The scale of the wildlife is a little bit different too, and that's important to me.
Yeah. Okay, so talk about the book. So in here is road ecology. So maybe let's just start there. What's road ecology? Why should I or listeners care about road ecology? You don't have to make it human-centered necessarily, but yeah, just tell us what it is and how we're impacted by it or we interact with it more frequently or commonly than we think, and yeah, why it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. So road ecology is this relatively small, but I would say very fast growing field of science that looks at how roads and nature interact. What does our transportation infrastructure do to ecosystems and wildlife, and those impacts or connections are they range from the obvious, like roadkill, right? We've all seen the dead deer by the side of the highway,
Mm-hmm.
and obviously road ecology is very concerned with that. But it's also focused on the barrier effect, the way that these constant walls of traffic that roll down our interstate highways prevent animals from migrating and moving around the landscape, and what impact does that have on their genetic exchange, their ability to find mates and reproduce. What about the impacts of road noise pollution? The constant
Mm-hmm.
roar of engines and tires. How does that affect the lives of wild animals and ecosystems? What about all of the road salt that we add to our highways as a de-icing agent? How does that change our rivers and lakes and streams? So road ecology is again, it's this field of research that looks at all of those different connections and relationships, and I think importantly what we do about them. Okay, we know that roads are bad for nature. That's fairly intuitive. How do we start to solve some of the problems that our highways create for ecosystems? And that's definitely something that road ecology is really focused on, is that kind of practical, solutions oriented application of science.
Yeah, I see it as a type of how do we live alongside other folks here in on the planet and here in the US and obviously globally as well is you don't want to just run through somebody's home, and of course there's always going to be sacrifices that are made. If you build roads, there's going to be somebody's some animal's home's going to be uprooted, but I think you can be careful and considerate of it, and that's not to say that people haven't, but there is this way of how are we neighbors with the elk and the deer and the possum and the raccoon and all these things?
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because that was one of the things that first attracted me to road ecology. I had the chance to take a tour of these wildlife crossings in Montana
Hmm.
back in 2013. Overpasses and underpasses, bridges and tunnels that basically allow animals to safely move back and forth across highways. And I mean, it was that idea of infrastructure, or at least wildlife crossing structures, as this form of ecological compassion or empathy. We know, as you say, that that human activity does so much harm to nature, and driving is the epitome of that. So how do we show compassion to our wild neighbors, as you put it, by helping them safely navigate the land? So that idea of a scientific field that's also kind of an expression of empathy for the wild critters that we cohabitate
Hmm.
with. I think that was the thing that really excited me about this topic. A decade ago.
Mm-hmm. Give us I guess a sort of snapshot or overview of what's our current landscape of roadways here in the U.S. And if you want to talk a little bit globally, you can too. But there's there's obviously a history to this. There's where it started, where it's become. Obviously, you have invention of the automobile. You have so many cars on the road, and obviously it's much different now than it was 100 years ago. But currently, yeah, what's the current landscape? You can throw out some numbers here if you want, or what's the what's it look like, and what are still, I guess, some of the problems? I mean, many people will kind of just casually know if they're driving, not even long distances, could be around their backyard, in their neighborhood or whatever. At certain periods out here on the East Coast, usually I think it's November to April is breeding season for deer, and they're just oh my
Mm.
gosh, just like all over the place. So much roadkill, it's awful.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, what's the kind of landscape at the moment?
Yeah, the landscape is well, there are just a crap load of roads, man. I mean, there are, we've got 4 million miles of road in the U.S., right? So we have
Mm,
the world's largest road network, larger than any other countries.
mm,
And it's as we've been talking about, this immense ecological crisis, right? I mean, there's literally nothing that we do that kills more wild animals than drive.
Mm.
It's just a gigantic problem. It's a conservation crisis for a lot of critters too, right? I think that's one of the
Yeah.
issues with roadkill is that logically enough, the animals that we see dead on the highway most often are the common, abundant animals, right?
Mm.
We see deer and raccoons and squirrels. And I think that we have this way of saying, maybe subconsciously, well, okay, some deer and squirrels got hit, but there are a lot of deer and squirrels out there, so it's not the end of the world. I mean, it is,
Mm.
literally the end of the world for those
For them,
individual
yes,
deer and
yeah, it's,
squirrels,
yeah,
right? But,
yeah.
I think that, one of the things that is becoming more and more true, unfortunately, is that there are also all of these threatened and endangered species that
Mm.
roadkill is literally driving to extinction, right? I mean, you think
Mm-hmm.
about, the Florida panther or the tiger salamander
Mm.
or the
Yeah.
ocelot, or the
Mm-hmm.
Hawaiian goose. There are all of these rare animals out there for which roadkill is the leading cause of mortality, right? And so, in that sense, I mean, we know that, we're in the middle of this global biodiversity crisis, this sixth mass extinction event in planetary history, and
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, roads and traffic are a huge part of that. And I mean,
It,
you alluded to the kind of the global scale of the problem. I think that's just an
mm-hmm.
important point too. Is that look here in the U.S. right? We have this giant interstate highway system that we built during the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're building a lot of new residential roads, but we're not building a lot of new major highways. Whereas other
Mm.
countries, like Kenya, Nepal, Myanmar, India,
Mm.
they're building out their infrastructure now. And those are also some of the most biodiverse countries left
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
Earth. And so
Mm-hmm.
how do we help those countries develop and reap the economic benefits of infrastructure without totally sacrificing tigers and
Mm-hmm.
elephants and rhinos and gorillas? I think that's the kind of the next
Mm-hmm.
great challenge: is how do we learn from all the things we screwed up in North America and help other countries build better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No. Yeah. For sure. For sure. Is now the highest amount of roadkill that we've ever had just because of how many cars are on the road, and is it are we just is it every year higher and higher numbers because there's more people on the road, there's more accidents, or is it just has there been a little bit of some, was there a peak and a little bit of a downturn based on efforts that people, conservationists or crossings or things like that, have tried to do to be like, all right, let's maybe bring that number down? Do you see that, or does it just keep rising every year?
That's such a good question. I think the answer is we don't really know because we don't have great data on exactly how
Mm.
many animals are killed by cars. I mean, it's interesting, right? It's so we do know that as a kind of a percent expressed as a percent of total animal death, roadkill is going up, right? Like if you're
Mm.
if you're an opossum, you're more likely to die because of a car than you were 50 years ago. We know that
Mm.
that roadkill expressed as kind of like a rate of mortality is going up. But, are more individual animals being killed now than 50 years ago? We don't really know. And I actually kind of suspect not, right? For the reason that we've killed a lot of them already, unfortunately.
Mm.
You mean, like, you
Yeah.
think about, like, turtles are a good example of this. Turtles are a really roadkill susceptible species, right? Because they're slow. And, that lots of turtles get hit by cars. We know that turtle populations are collapsing all over North America. There are many fewer turtles today than there were 100 years ago. So there are also fewer turtles being hit by cars. But that's not a good thing in this case, right? It just means there are fewer turtles out there. So I actually think that that, like, it's conceivable that the total number of animals hit by cars every day is actually lower than it was 50 years ago. But maybe that's just because there are fewer animals out there to kill.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, it's a sobering thought.
Yeah,
So
this is
I
a really
guess
happy book, right?
right, right. So I mean, maybe just kind of introduce us with the idea, kind of the title of the book, and what you talk about a lot, and we can talk about specific examples or other case examples, but tell us about these road crossings. So you kind of alluded to it. Now, I've traveled a lot out west. I've traveled all over Wyoming. I've traveled all over Montana, a little bit of Colorado, Utah. So I've traveled a lot out there, and it was, I think, in Montana. Yes, I think it's where. Yes, I'm pretty sure that's where it was, where I first saw this, and I
Yeah.
was like, oh. That's super cool. Why aren't we doing this everywhere? This makes a lot of sense. Like, why,
Yeah.
why wouldn't we do this? So maybe just tell us what it is and kind of just paint for us a picture of what they kind of usually look like, what the motivation is for building them, how they're constructed, what some of the data goes into saying like, okay, we're going to place it here. We're going to place it with this amount of, let's say, vegetation or these amounts of things or this high or this low. You kind of just give us some of the details about how these things work. And maybe you can use Wyoming or Montana as an example.
For sure. So, so these wildlife crossings, right? I mean, that's basically any passage that allows an animal to safely go over and under a highway, right? And, as you're alluding to, I mean, they come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes, in Wyoming and Montana and here in Colorado, you see these wildlife overpasses, right? Which basically look like these big kind of beautiful curving bridges that go over highways, and they're typically landscaped, with native vegetation. So, maybe that's sagebrush or rabbit brush out here in Colorado. Just the idea being to create sort of as natural an ecosystem as possible for those animals that are that are crossing, and you're just trying to create sort of a seamless transition between the surrounding landscape and this bridge so that they find it appealing. And then I mean, much more common than the overpasses are underpasses. These structures that go under highways, which sometimes look like sort of concrete tunnels. That's not ideal. More and more you see these kind of big, expansive underpasses with dirt floors, and often there are streams running through them. It's interesting. I mean, to think about, as you say, you do tend to see them out west much more commonly. I do think that the western states, especially Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, have been really proactive about building these things. And I think that a big part of the reason is just the different way that wildlife behaves regionally. So here in the West, because there's such an elevational gradient, animals tend to migrate long distances, right? So they're walking between their summer range up in the mountains and their winter range down in the valleys, the low elevations where there's less snow and they can feed more easily and the weather's a little better. And they tend to migrate in these big herds, right? So you get, in some places, hundreds and hundreds of mule deer and elk and antelope, all walking across the landscape together, which also means they're crossing highways together in the same place year after year. These migration pathways can be really consistent. So if you have 1,000 mule deer all crossing a highway in Wyoming at the same place every year, pretty soon there's this big pile of carcasses saying, hey, put a wildlife underpass right here, right? This is where the roadkill hotspot is. Whereas in the Northeast, in a place like Maryland, I mean, they're just kind of like white-tailed deer everywhere all the time, or at least that's how it feels, right? So there aren't necessarily these really discrete hot spots on the landscape. And I think that's made it possible for eastern states to say, well, it's fine for, Colorado and Wyoming to build those things, but they don't really apply, here in the East. But, over time, I do think that more eastern states are realizing, what, it feels like white-tailed deer are all over the place, but actually they are, walking along certain habitat corridors, and as data improves, we actually can install these wildlife crossings and and benefit from it. So like Virginia's done a lot of cool wildlife crossing work, or at least some cool wildlife crossing work. Now Connecticut and Pennsylvania and North Carolina are getting into it too. So I think that some of those regional divides that you've observed, those are starting to break down a little bit.
Yeah, I'll come to that in a second. I'll just say, again, having spent some good time out in the mountain states, for listeners that maybe haven't been out west, I mean, you'll know this, but just to paint a picture of it. So when you're driving out in Wyoming tends to be pretty windy, right? It's especially out in East Wyoming. It's a absolutely gorgeous state. If you're up there by Montana, also big sky. If you're in North Dakota, South Dakota, it's big sky country. It's absolutely gorgeous, but it's one of those things where you'll have, a 1 or 2 lane highway or whatever, and for, I mean, literally hundreds of miles. I mean, that's even like your major highways are going to be for just 1 or 2 lanes for hundreds of miles, and sometimes towns can be 60, 70 miles apart. Like you're not, it's pretty rural. I mean, it's pretty out there. And so when you're driving, and again, you can be on a big interstate, in these places, if you think about, like, if you go out to, like, northeast Colorado, right before Nebraska, I mean, it's pretty wide open there, right?
Yeah.
The speed limits are 75, 80, right, miles. That's the speed limit, and in many cases, many people are, because it's such long distances you're traversing, they're going to do 90, 95, right? I mean, you can get away with doing 90 out there, and you'll be all right, right? Because there's you don't want to. Everything over there, if it says it takes 35 minutes to get from point A to point B, it is every second of 35 minutes. It's not, if I drive a little bit faster, I'll beat some traffic. No, it is every second of 35 minutes.
Right.
And so the thing that becomes really imperative here is, if you're going at those high speeds, which is fine, and there's some animal crossings, I mean, that's like worse than hitting a car. I mean, you could die. The animal's going to die, and you are going to die. You are going at high speeds. And sometimes it's just, you don't even know. It's just going to pop right out onto the road, whatever. It could be elk, it could be deer, it could be, whatever. And it's just going to be like, oh, that's a hazard. Like, that's a really big hazard. You're more likely to hit those types of animals than you are another car in some cases. So there's a lot of, I think you could see maybe on the human side, why, like, places like Wyoming are going to probably welcome government projects. Typically a pretty conservative states' rights kind of place, but they're going to welcome government projects to help with highways. Do you think that there's some kind of incentive there? Do you think that those types of things could be applied in other places, or is it just really regionally based, where Southwest Virginia is pretty rural, but it's obviously not the same as Wyoming. But maybe you could have a mixture of people saying, "Hey, this has worked in other places, and we can build some of these things to, yes, preserve animals and wildlife, but also to prevent people from hitting animals and potentially dying." I mean, you hit an animal full 80 miles an hour, you're going to die. I mean, do you think there's some kind of, like, incentive in that way for people to listen to this kind of stuff?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think I think that when you talk about a rural place like Wyoming, or as you say, Southwest Virginia or West Virginia, another state with a really high rate of deer collisions. I mean, I think that there are a couple of big incentives, right? I mean, one big incentive, as you say, is that safety piece. We know that hundreds of drivers, as you're alluding to, die in these animal collisions every year, right? It's a really big it's a really big public health and safety crisis, and that's especially true in a place like Wyoming. I mean, there are stretches of highway in Wyoming where 75% of crashes are animal related, right? Huge health and safety problem. And it's a huge economic problem, right? I mean, the average deer collision in America now costs more than $9,000. The average elk collision is more than $20,000, right? So these are, and that's just hospital bills, vehicle repairs, insurance costs, et cetera. So, so there's this really big economic argument in favor of reducing these collisions, and wildlife crossings and roadside fences are really important in that way, right? And those projects tend to pay for themselves pretty quickly by preventing a lot of those dangerous, expensive crashes. You put in a stretch of roadside fencing and some wildlife crossings, and typically you're looking at a collision reduction of more than 90%. Which represents a pretty big cost savings for the public in the long run. So there's that public health and safety piece, which I think is a big part of why a lot of the transportation departments are interested in this solution now. And then in a place like Wyoming, I mean, there's also a really big sort of advocacy component from the hunting lobby, right? That deer hunters, they love deer. They love to hunt them, and they care about them, in their own way, and they don't want to see them dead on the highway. No more than anybody else does, and probably less than a lot of people do. And so, in Wyoming, I mean, the mule deer hunting lobby and various deer hunting groups have been really powerful and effective advocates and lobbyists for more of these wildlife crossings. And I'd imagine that would be the same in a place like Western Virginia. So that's that's kind of the beautiful thing about this issue, right? Is that like whatever you care about, whether it's animal rights and welfare, whether it's about public health and safety, whether it's about preserving sort of huntable herds of healthy animals, whether it's about insurance costs, there's kind of something in it for everybody, and I think that's one of the reasons that you see such incredibly high approval ratings for wildlife crossings. Like here in Colorado, there was just a big public opinion poll that found that I think 86% of Coloradans supported more wildlife crossings. And you couldn't get 86% of Coloradans to agree that the sky is blue, right? So this is a really popular intervention, and I think a lot of it is because it just activates so many different interests, whether you're liberal, conservative, a hunter, or a humane society member. There's something in this for you.
Yeah, it's interesting how those things bring people together in some ways.
Yeah.
Tell us about these Banff crossings. This is like the gold standard. And of course, it looks absolutely, the design of it is beautiful. But so Banff National Park is up in, I guess it's not northern Canada. I guess it's sort of northern Canada, central Canada, whatever.
Yeah.
But it's
Western
in Alberta, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Right. Yep. And so there's. If people think on a map, if they see Montana in their head, Glacier is right there, and then it dips over into Canada. You have Jasper and you have Banff, and so it's kind of central Canada, absolutely gorgeous. I haven't been myself, but you've been to Banff?
A couple times, yeah. I'm going next week actually.
I'm jealous. I'm so jealous. I'm so jealous.
Pretty spectacular.
And so they have these crossings. What's made them kind of the gold standard, the model, and what's made them so effective? Granted, it's terribly rural. There's a lot of animal wildlife there. It's pretty out there, gorgeous out in nature. But what's made them the kind of gold standard over there?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Banff because it is really an amazing project. So Banff, yes, it's a national park, but it has a highway running right through the middle of it, the Trans Canada Highway. And so historically, they had huge problems with deer and elk and bear collisions, all kinds of critters. So in the 1980s, the Parks Canada, the big government agency, basically began installing underpasses, but below the highway for deer and elk primarily. And what they found out there was that the deer and elk use those underpasses, but a lot of the big carnivores, especially grizzly bears, didn't really use those underpasses very readily. And the reason for that is that, if you're a grizzly bear, bears, right, they're these huge, powerful animals, they're super fast, right? They're faster than horses. They want to be out in open space. They don't want to be passing through a little tunnel. They want to be like up on the deck of a bridge, out in the open. And so, what the sort of the engineers who ran that project realized was that they really did need overpasses as well as underpasses for grizzly bears specifically, and so they built I think around a half dozen overpasses in the 1990s and 2000s. Again primarily for bears, and it was sort of this fascinating learning experience because at first the bears really didn't use them initially. Grizzly bears are kind of very smart, wary, cautious animals. They're not like a deer that just sort of like walks anywhere. They're like, hey, what is this weird new bridge? I don't know if I feel totally comfortable here. So, at first they didn't really get a lot of bear use, and people were like, well, are these crossings really effective? Maybe not. But then, it just turned out that the bears were just, acclimating and habituating to them and learning to use them. And after a few years, bear usage of these crossings just went through the roof. It rose exponentially, and bears were going back and forth and mating on either side of the highway, and the sows, the females, would teach their cubs to become crossers, and then their cubs would teach their cubs. So there's kind of this cool intergenerational learning process that happened among grizzly bears, and I think that proved beyond any doubt that wildlife crossings were effective. I think prior to Banff, there was some skepticism, certainly among engineers, but also among some scientists, and then all of this great research in Banff National Park just showed very clearly that that again, I mean, even grizzly bears, kind of the ultimate wary, cautious animal would use these crossings, and that the crossings could heal the sorts of ecological divides that the highway created.
Mm. Yeah, I was thinking about when you were mentioning about like kind of the differences between different parts of the country, and my thing is, if you build it, they're going to get there. Eventually, they're
Yeah,
going to be interested. They're going to look at it and be like, you know what, or they're going to see other people and like, yeah, okay, like obviously animals like anyone else, they're going to be able to say like, oh, okay, yes, like this very fast moving object that's on this road is going to hurt me. Like eventually,
yeah.
you're going to get wise and be like, all right, then let me go around this way so that way I don't get hit. So it's interesting how it became kind of a really nice standard. So it's really really nice. How many now? I guess on an estimate, or you can just tell us by state, or you can tell us, if there's a certain number. How many road crossings that that are established? How many are in the U.S. now? Is there a number? Do you know, or ballpark it? Is it a couple hundred, a couple dozen? What's the kind of ballpark of where we're at the moment?
Yeah, I'd say ballpark a couple thousand probably.
Nice.
And yeah, I mean it's funny, like one perspective, right? That sounds like a lot. At the same time, we have 4 million miles of road, right? Which means if we
Right.
have, let's just say, very ballpark, 2,000 wildlife crossings. That's one wildlife crossing for every 2,000 miles of road. So
Wow.
that's
Wow.
not a
Wow.
that means that you could basically drive from New York to Colorado and see one wildlife crossing, which is just again we know that given the huge scale of the problem is not nearly enough. So yeah, we've built some of
Mm,
these things, but we just need so many more. And fortunately, there is more. There's certainly a lot more interest in this stuff than there was 10 or 20 years ago, and there's a lot more funding for it too. There's this big $350 million federal program to fund more
mm,
wildlife passages, and then a bunch of states have their own state funding allocated for wildlife crossing. So this is something that we're devoting more attention and economic resources towards, but we're still not nearly thinking about it and working on it at the scale that we need to.
yeah. Now, how much of this is, the players here, right? So this isn't. This is mostly in, the Forest Service is really an important part here. You can tell us about the Wilderness Act, but how much of this is, who's doing this? So I guess the obvious thing would be like, well, the federal government here in the U.S. But is there an interplay between certain, private groups maybe that are invested, certain conservation groups in conjunction with federal government? Like, I don't want to make this too political between, federal state, but what's that, I guess, interaction between how much the federal government is involved and should be, and other players that are involved in doing this? What's the kind of pulse on that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly, all of these projects kind of activate so many different groups and players, right? I mean, there a lot of these wildlife crossings, of course, are happening on federal highways and interstate highways, which is U.S. DOT's responsibility. So certainly, the federal government is really involved in these projects. State transportation departments and state wildlife agencies are also really involved. Typically it's a state wildlife agency, who's kind of identifying the problem, right? They're saying, hey, we have this deer or elk migration that crosses the highway right here. What are we going to do about it? So so the states are really involved. Certainly those conservation groups, groups like the National Wildlife Federation in California, they're largely responsible for this giant wildlife crossing that's being built outside of Los Angeles now for mountain lions, that I bet a lot of
Mm,
listeners have heard of. So the conservation
mhm,
organizations are playing a big part, and then the other important player in a lot of this are actually native tribes. Um,
mm,
there are tribes like the Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico, or the Puyallup in Washington, who have done, or like the Burns Paiute in Oregon, who have done a lot of the data collection on wildlife, moving in and out of their reservations and having to cross highways along the way. And they've done a lot of the kind of the advocacy, because they care deeply about wildlife, both from a kind of a cultural perspective and also, as a subsistence food source. So often it's those native tribes now, raising these issues to state and federal government, and in some cases actually getting the funding themselves to build some of these passages. So yeah, I mean that's kind of one of the interesting things about this issue. And then you mentioned the Forest Service, right? And that's another giant player. Is these big land management agencies, the U.S. Forest Service, the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, which oftentimes, are essentially responsible for managing the habitat on either side of the highway, right? Maybe it's a state highway, but it's running through a big national forest, which is federal land. So you have this kind of challenge of coordination between a state transportation department and a federal land management agency. So I think that's a big part of, unfortunately, why we haven't built more of these wildlife crossings, because they just tend to be so politically complex, and you have to get all of these different players and stakeholders on board.
Mm. We've been talking a lot about rural areas, and you sort of mentioned it here with the bit in LA.
Yeah.
What about for cities? I mean, this is another big thing. As cities keep expanding, and obviously we have many things that roads and noise and pollution and all these things. What's the kind of space of doing this? I'm assuming that you can get creative in cities in doing this, but what's the kind of idea? So maybe California is a good example with mountain lions, of course, but also maybe other cities as well, where you're thinking about animals that fly, or sort for things for like certain birds, or you mentioned butterflies in one chapter in the book with the
Yeah.
windshield phenomenon. But yeah, tell us about cities, though. I guess where's the place for this for big cities? How we could do it? What's the need, and how could maybe be seen or known in cities, and how to be helpful?
Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, I think that, look, I mean, cities they're really biodiverse places. They
Yeah.
do often have a lot of wildlife. I mean, LA is an amazing example of that, right? It's this big sprawling city that has lots of
Hmm.
little pockets of
Yep.
oak woodland and chaparral and all these different ecosystems.
Hmm.
It's got bobcats and coyotes and and mountain lions. It's one of the only major cities in the world that has big cats within its city limits, which is pretty incredible. And so
Yeah.
there, they're building a wildlife overpass. By Agora Hills, right, which is like where the Kardashians live. Which
Hmm.
is just
Hmm.
pretty amazing. So, I don't want to say that every urban area is right for a wildlife crossing, right? I'm not sure that a wildlife crossing would accomplish much on the Lower East Side in Manhattan. But we know that animals
But, but
are
maybe
in
but maybe maybe a place like Florida, though, right? Where they have so many
totally.
alligators and crocodiles. I mean, there has to be some version of that where it's like, yeah, I mean, how they're going in people's swimming pools, and it's a big I mean, it's a legitimate problem in Florida, in
Oh no, yeah,
in
and they're
Louisiana.
absolutely, yeah. And there are underpasses in Florida that have been used by alligators, just which is
Mm,
pretty cool. So they've done
mm,
a bit of that. But I mean, to me, it's like it gets back to what you said about being a good neighbor earlier, right? Is that
yeah.
animals are already kind of living alongside of us in these urban and suburban areas, and in some cases they've adapted pretty well, right? Like there are coyotes in Chicago who famously cross at the crosswalks when the light turns red. I mean, they're really good pedestrians. So animals are kind of doing their part to survive alongside us, and building wildlife crossings, to my mind, is part of us doing our part. To say, hey,
Mhm,
wildlife is welcome here, and we are going to be good neighbors and invite these animals to
mm,
survive on the landscape alongside of us.
mm. Yeah, I think that's important, and I think if you're able to see how we can be creative in doing that. I guess this is a kind of goes back to one of the kind of the first points that I had is why these things are important. So it's obviously important for conservation ideas for different animals, but it's also important for us as well
Yeah,
with car accidents, but also other types of things that can happen where some of these animals we're kind of the invasive species of sorts, right? And this is
yeah,
their home. So we're the ones that are kind of like kind of creating a mess of things. But there's a way to do it, and you don't want, you know, the mountain lion in your backyard, you don't want the alligator in your swimming pool, all these things. So, yeah, I mean, there is impact for us as well. I guess what is the kind of, I mean, aside that everyone should go pick up your book and read it. It's fantastic.
Yeah,
But
there you go.
aside
Thanks,
from
Xavier.
that, aside from that, what's a good consciousness raising kind of thing, I guess, about how we can get people to see the importance of this aside from, yeah, I didn't think about this until I got in an accident and totally messed up my car and I had to, it shouldn't take that bit of it. I know for a lot of people it does, but yeah, what's a way or good consciousness raising kind of way for this to get on people's radar, I guess.
Yeah, that's an awesome question, and honestly, I wish I knew. I wish I had the perfect answer, because then this would be more in people's consciousnesses than it is. I think that certainly that that human safety piece is a big part of it, but I also think that look, on some level, I think that people care about wildlife, right? We just have this
Yeah.
innate
Yeah.
love of animals. Like I go onto Instagram every day, and I follow all of these wildlife photography accounts, and every single
Mm-hmm.
picture they take
Very
of a
popular. Very
bear or
popular.
a moose, right, gets
Mm-hmm.
100,000
Yeah.
likes. People
Right.
people are predisposed to care about animals. They just don't really think about them a whole lot in their daily lives, and
Mm-hmm.
to me, I think that's one of the beautiful things about wildlife overpasses in particular, is that they're really visible, right? Like, you drive around Wyoming, and you see these wildlife overpasses, and you're reminded that, oh yeah, we share this landscape with deer and elk and moose and bears and all kinds of amazing critters, and again, like, these crossings are incredibly popular. People generally want to build more of them, because we just have this baseline appreciation of wildlife, and I think that that's the again kind of the beauty of these crossings, is that they're sort of billboards for the fact that we share this landscape with non-human beings. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's interesting too. You mentioned that, right, like, do we really want to invite mountain lions to cross the highway and come into our backyards? And that's an argument I've heard from people, certainly, is like, should we be helping animals move through our human dominated landscapes? And
Mm-hmm.
to me, I guess my rejoinder to that would be that they're already here, right? They're already
Yeah.
out there doing their thing, and in some ways, building crossings and letting them live healthier, more natural lives is part of is actually, there's a kind of a human connection there, a human safety connection there, right? You think about there have been incidents of mountain lions in California, attacking dogs because the mountain lions had been injured by cars and they couldn't hunt their normal prey. Mountain lions as well. That's it's when they can't disperse out to natural territories and live in relatively wild areas. That's when they end up entering people's backyards, because they've tried to cross a freeway, haven't been able to make it, and had to turn around and set up shop on your back porch. So by building these wildlife crossings and letting animals perform their natural behaviors and movements, in a sense, we're also reducing the potential for conflict with us.
Yeah, that's really nice. How about global? We mentioned it earlier, but I guess positive, negative. So, how have people maybe done it better in other countries? They've really done. There's other places. I think in places in Latin America. There's been places in maybe Asia, maybe parts of Europe, of course. What's Switzerland doing, right? How are they handling this, right?
Yeah.
What are they doing? What's Austria doing, right? Yeah. There's places where maybe they've done it better. Maybe they've got a better handle on this, and kind of like you mentioned before, there's obviously some places where they're just kind of coming online to really, or not, they're kind of expanding more of their roads and infrastructure, so they're going to have to really hopefully take care of this, especially for some pretty endangered species that live in those areas. So
Yeah.
yeah, maybe just globally, what's it look like? We mentioned Canada, but outside North America, I guess, where are some other places that we see what they've done, positive or negative?
Yeah, look, I think that one of our challenges here in the U.S., right, is that we built our interstate highway system in the 1960s and 70s before we fully understood just how bad major highways were for wildlife, right? And now we're kind of stuck with, millions of miles of concrete and asphalt. And yeah, we can do a little bit of retrofitting, right? We can put up a wildlife crossing here and there, but the roads themselves are basically we're stuck with them. Whereas there are all of these countries, in the quote unquote developing world that are building out their infrastructure now, and they can again learn from our mistakes and do it right the first time. And you see some of that happening. Like Nepal, for example, has laws requiring wildlife crossings with any new highway, in wildlife habitat. And we certainly don't have anything like that, right? In India, they've built highways on elevated concrete pillars so that the whole forest floor is wide open for miles at a time, and animals can safely wander back and forth, which is much more radical and creative than anything we've done in the U.S. because again they're building from scratch rather than retrofitting like we are. So there's a a lot of exciting stuff happening globally. I guess the question and the issue is is it happening fast enough? In Kenya, for example, there are something like 30 new highways proposed that would run through national parks, and I mean, there's no way to make those, totally positive for nature, right? Even if you build wildlife crossings with them, they're still going to have huge noise and pollution impacts, right? So, we're, I think that we as a global community are getting better at building environmentally friendly roads when we want to. The problem is that we're just building so many roads that nature is being overwhelmed.
Mm. Quickly here, I guess last two questions here is you talk about the anthropause. So it was this really interesting thing that was happening, right in 2020.
Yeah.
I don't think much in 2021, but in 2020, because everyone literally was at home, no one was anywhere. We were all inside because of the pandemic. We just saw wildlife just kind of going in through all the places humans do, walking around the streets and getting into things. And
Totally.
it's some, not just like your raccoons or whatever, like real, serious animals that were walking about. It was just it's such an interesting reminder. I mean, what was your kind of, thoughts on that, unexpected experiment that happened, and with, less humans kind of milling about? What was your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think that, obviously COVID was this huge public health catastrophe, right? Not something that we'd want to ever ever repeat. But I do think that the silver lining, if there was one, is that it showed us that animals respond really quickly when you remove traffic, right? There were studies in Maine finding that the survival of breeding frogs and salamanders is much higher because they weren't, of course, being hit by cars while they migrate to their breeding ponds on those warm, wet spring nights, right? There's a cool study in San Francisco basically finding that without all of that traffic noise pollution, white-crowned sparrows could sing much more complex songs that traveled much further across the landscape to find mates, right? So this is, I mean, the animals are there. They're waiting for us to kind of get out of their way. And yeah, okay, we don't, maybe we don't want to ever shut down traffic on a global scale like that again. But, can we take that lesson and apply it at other scales? Maybe that means, dramatically reducing traffic in our national parks, right? By, forcing visitors to ride buses instead of taking their private vehicles. Maybe it means, closing national parks to traffic at night, as they do in some other countries. Maybe it means implementing, kind of seasonal road closures near important amphibian breeding habitat. You've got a road running through a wetland. Maybe let's just shut that road down at night in spring when animals are crossing it to mate. So again, I mean, COVID, yeah, not something that we ever want to repeat, obviously, but I think we can take those lessons and apply them locally and turn off traffic strategically where animals need it to be turned off.
Mm. Yeah, and I guess finally, what do you see as the future? I guess of road ecology and road crossings. How do you see things kind of moving forward, both globally here in the U.S., at the local level, at the federal level? Are we going to see more of these pop up? Are we going to see more kind of people raising an awareness about this? How do you see? What's your, I guess, optimistic message about the future of this?
Yeah, I think optimistically, yes, we're definitely going to see more of these crossings moving forward. I guess the question is how many more, right? And we're recording this conversation, before the election, and I'm not sure, when it's going to air. But it's easy to imagine a world in which there's not a lot of new federal funding forthcoming for these things, and it's something that conservation organizations and states have to do basically on their own. I certainly hope that's not the case, but it's certainly one possible future. So I'm concerned about that, obviously. I think that from an optimistic perspective, one development that I think we'll certainly see is different types of wildlife crossings being built, wildlife overpasses especially, and one of the really exciting technologies that there are researchers working on now are wildlife crossings built out of different materials rather than the usual steel and
Mm,
concrete,
mm,
being built out of sort of lighter polymers and fibers that first will be ultimately cheaper in the long run. They can be assembled much more quickly than a traditional overpass, and they're potentially modular, so they could be disassembled and reassembled. So you could
mm,
imagine, in a world of climate change, maybe
mhm,
the place where the elk are crossing the highway today is not the place they'll be crossing the highway 10 years from now. Maybe they're going to move north with climate change, as so many animals are doing. So in that scenario, you could basically disassemble a wildlife overpass and then rebuild it 10 miles up the highway. So that that sort of thing, the idea of adaptive, responsive wildlife crossings that you can actually move around the landscape in coordination with wildlife movement. I think that's a one really exciting future direction that this concept is going.
Yeah, that's important stuff. And again, I will be paying attention with much interest, as I'm sure you'll be right there with it as well. Ben, this was so much fun. I really did enjoy your book. I've enjoyed this conversation. It's an important topic that probably needs more attention, and so you're doing great things. And I will look forward to being green with jealousy and envy at all of your pictures from Banff. So
All right,
I'm wishing you well, man. I'm wishing you well.
I'll send you a few, dude. Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right, thanks.